this is a really important story to tell, and to understand this is particularly now, because, as I was saying before, race is central to our story. Race, race, race. And a lot of people don't like that. And a lot of people don't want to hear about it.
Welcome to the End Game. I'm Tom Shanahan, your host, and we have the most unique I've ever had on this series. It's one of those truth is stranger than fiction stories. So I'm going to tell you, well, first of all, let me introduce my guest. His name is Hillary Shockley. I won't tell you anything more about him, except that Hillary was a college football player. Went on to a successful career at a major university, went on to a successful career in the banking, mortgage, and real estate business. Is that right, Hillary?
Yes.
Yeah, welcome.
Thanks for having
me. Okay, so I'm about to tell you about a night, September 12th, 1970, in college football. A team from the Pac-8, an integrated football team from the Pac-8. They went down to a famous Southern stadium in the South, played against a famous Southern coach known for his segregated teams. And he had another great team, ranked number 4 in the nation. And they got run over by the Pac-8 team before their all-white defense got run over by the Pac-8 team. And the star of the game was a black fullback. And most of the people out there who have been duped by the myths about the 1970 USC-Alabama game think that I'm talking about Sam Cunningham. I'm not. I'm talking about the true star of September 12th, 1970, Hillary Shockley, Hillary the Shocker Shockley, Stanford University fullback, all minority backfield, and they ran over number 4 ranked Arkansas and beat them. Hillary, he finished his night here. Look, where's my stats? 3 touchdowns. 149 total yards. And if I have to remind people, Sam Cunningham finished with only 2 touchdowns and 135 yards. And so people who follow me know I've been writing about how this game is the USC-Alabama game is 99% myths and fiction. It was made up 20 years after the game was played to whitewash Alabama coach Bear Bryant's record. And I'm digging through some of the LA Times, and I come across this Stanford Arkansas game, and I'm reading about Hillary Shockley dominating on a national TV game. USC Alabama was not on TV. And all these years later, Hillary, you are the guys who did the real dominating that night, not USC and Alabama. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you've told me that at Rose Bowl reunions, players have talked about how come USC gets all this credit for something that we did.
Well, in my 4 years at Stanford, of course, we had a great team, the great Jim Plunkett, who was our quarterback, Jackie Brown, who was my running mate, number 33. We had a great team, and we beat USC.
That's right.
And UCLA 3 out of the 4 years that I attended Stanford. And we won, as you know, 2 back-to-back Rose Bowls. We beat Ohio State, which was number 1 in the country, probably the biggest upset in the history of the Rose Bowl. And then the next year we beat Michigan. So we were a
Thank you.
special, and of course we had the SC had the Wild Bunch, but we had the Thunder Chickens.
Yes.
We had Jim Butler and Greg Sampson and Rick Tipton, and, Hollywood Roger Cowan. So we had a great team. And we were a unique bunch of guys born in the 1950s.
Yeah.
I was born in 1950, and we had I remember my first year as a freshman. I was walking to my dorm and I saw a couple of guys and I said, wow, those must be the varsity. Well, when I went out for freshman ball, all those were the guys on my team. I said, wow, we got a team here. I thought those guys were varsity. And lo and behold, they were 1950 babies like me.
Yeah. Yeah. And we should add here, you're wearing your authentic Rose Bowl jersey.
Oh, yeah.
Hillary, the Shocker Shockley. Now, is that from the Ohio State Rose Bowl or the Michigan Rose Bowl?
Ohio State.
Okay. Yeah. And like you say, that was one of the biggest upsets in Rose Bowl history because up until the 70s, the Big Ten had dominated the
Right.
Pac 8 in the Rose Bowl. But a few points I want to make. Well, first of all, let me put it this way. Hillary, if someone at Stanford had made up a story about Stanford coming up with a secret plan to integrate college football down in the South, you'd be Sam Cunningham. Instead, you're just an unknown Hillary Shockley. What do you think about that?
Well, I got to tell you, I love Sam Cunningham. He passed recently, a great guy. I met him at another buddy of ours, a guy by the name who played linebacker at UCLA and went on and played at the Dallas Cowboys, Calvin Peterson's house. So a bunch of the guys would meet there. And Sam Cunningham was just an awesome guy. And when I would go to Las Vegas, I would go to Randall Cunningham's church called the Remnant.
Right.
And so Sam was a great guy, and we had, life is full of surprises, and but what made football so nice and wonderful for me is the people. We had some great people, the coaches. We had John Ralston was my coach,
right,
and he was quite a guy.
Yeah.
And
let me say here that I don't mean to make it sound like I'm criticizing Sam Cunningham. I'm criticizing the people who made up the story.
Oh yeah.
And this is for our viewers to understand also. They made up this story to whitewash Bear Bryant's career, and they basically used Sam Cunningham as a pawn. And the people that have paid for it are the true pioneers of the 1960s who sacrificed and went through a lot, and they made it possible. They made the college football integration fait accompli by 1970, and they made it possible for USC to go down to the Deep South and play Alabama on September 12th, 1970. And at that same weekend, that same day, they made it possible for ABC to match up Stanford with Heisman Trophy quarterback candidate Jim Plunkett and Arkansas, a national title favorite, to play in War Memorial Stadium in Fayetteville. Those things wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the sacrifices of Jerry Levias at SMU in 1965, Warren McVeigh at Houston, 1964, Darrell Hill at Maryland, 1963, Bob Grant at Wake Forest, 1964, Wilbur Hackett and his three black teammates at Kentucky, 1966 and 1967, Lester McLean, 1967, and even Auburn was integrated before Alabama with James Owens. A fact that people don't understand is Alabama was the 7th of 10 SEC schools to integrate. And so actually Bear Bryant was dragging his feet, resisting, and he should not be portrayed as a crusader. That's the main point of all the stories I've written, and why I was just fascinated to come across a story about Stanford and Arkansas, which I have on my website, and with the headline, "The Game That History Forgot," because you guys did everything and more than USC. USC didn't even make a bowl game. They got routed by UCLA 45-20. And as we already discussed, you guys went on and won the Pac-8, played Ohio State in the Rose Bowl, and it was one of the biggest upsets in Rose Bowl history. So you guys deserve a place in history before USC. And the guy who really gets hurt by this, I want to bring this up to him. Well, first of all, I'll save that for a moment later, because you mentioned to me, Hillary, that you guys have been at your Rose Bowl reunions, and you've talked about how you guys have been shoved aside for this USC game. And in my research, I talked to Lester McLean at Tennessee. He was their first Black player in 1967. And I asked Lester what he thinks about Alabama getting and Bear Bryant getting all the credit. And he said, there is more fiction in those 1970 USC Alabama stories than anything. You'd think that that's when the SEC began recruiting Black athletes. I was almost out of school by 1970. Wilbur Hackett at Kentucky. I was very disappointed with the way, and by the way, he means the documentaries you see on TV. I was very disappointed with the way they portrayed Bryant. I have the utmost respect for him as a football coach, but what they showed was totally wrong. They wrote it as if Bear Bryant desegregated the Southeastern Conference. So I'm imagining if these guys were invited to one of your reunions, they'd have a lot to talk about with you and your buddies, right?
That's right. That's right. We were, Stanford was kind of an anomaly because what we did had never been done in the history of Stanford. Jim Plunkett is the only Heisman Trophy winner from Stanford in the history.
Yeah.
Even though we had Andrew Luck, and we had before that John Elway, but none of them. But they didn't win the Heisman Trophy, because the reality is, in order to win the Heisman Trophy, you can't win a Heisman Trophy with a bad team.
Right.
No matter how good you are. And so I like to say, or I think that we have a pretty good basis for saying that our 1971-72 Rose Bowl teams at Stanford, probably the best backfield in the history of Stanford. Probably.
Yeah.
We have a strong case because we were the only ones to win 2 back-to-back Rose Bowls in the history. I mean, I've been out of school 50 years.
Yeah.
So how much more history do you need?
Yeah.
We're the only team, and we were the first team to start 2 Black running backs, along with Jim Plunkett, who is Indian or Hispanic or whatever. But he's a minority of some sort.
Yeah, Mexican American, and I think on his mother's side he had a lot of Indian blood.
Yeah,
I should say Native American.
Right, and so we have we probably were the best team in the history of Stanford.
Yeah,
probably.
Yeah, and that's another point I failed to make a little bit earlier when I was talking about how you guys kept rolling all the way to the Pac-8 and the Rose Bowl. You had an all-minority backfield, and this is another myth that USC tries to spread, that they were ahead of college football with their all-minority backfield. They had 3 African Americans in their backfield, but you had an all-minority backfield. Michigan State had all-minority backfields in 65 and 66. Your all-minority backfield with a Heisman Trophy winner, Jim Plunkett, the first Mexican American. I believe he's still the only one to win the Heisman Trophy. Tell us a little bit about Jim Plunkett, what kind of a team leader he was.
Well, Jim was a guy who led by example. We were obviously, when you're performing and when you're winning, you get the respect of everybody you play with. And something that was very unusual and unique is I learned that Jim Plunkett was recruited at Stanford as a defensive lineman. And I got to tell you,
Who was the scout on that one?
well, I got to tell you, playing with him, he was tough. This guy was tough. He had the grit of a defensive lineman.
Yeah,
the way he played.
yeah.
And of course, after Stanford, he went to the Patriots, and this was way before the Patriots were a winning team.
Yeah, yeah.
And he really got beat up. By that I mean he had over a dozen operations.
Yeah.
From shoulder to knee to whatever, and then for him to come back and win 2 Super Bowls with the Raiders.
Yeah. And let's add, Hillary, that back then the league, a quarterback took a lot more hits than they do now.
Oh, he took them all. That's when his wrestling
legal hits.
Right. And that's when the wrestling background kicked in, because any other guy would have folded and went out and rode off in the sunset.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have been playing anymore.
Yeah.
But he stuck in there and won a true champion.
Yeah.
He stuck in there and won 2 Super Bowls. And I'm appalled that he's not in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah. Yeah. Two
I mean, because sometimes you can win the Hall of Fame by overcoming adversity.
Exactly.
And he certainly did that.
Yeah. And another point I want to make, Jim was from Palo Alto, right next to the Stanford campus. You were from Los Angeles High School, correct?
Right.
Where was Jackie Brown from?
Jackie Brown was from Yakima, Washington.
Okay, so he was out of state.
Yeah.
The USC, they talk about their backfield. Jimmy Jones is from Pennsylvania. Sam Cunningham was from Santa Barbara, which is not Los Angeles. It's very far north. And Clarence Davis was a junior college recruit. Back in those days, USC, people don't understand this. Back in those 60s, USC was one of the schools that followed an unwritten quota where they didn't want more than a half dozen black players. They only had 5 on their 1962 national championship team. They only had 7 on their 1967 national championship. And one of them was a junior college transfer from San Francisco named O.J. Simpson.
O.J. Simpson.
Yeah. And it wasn't until after Michigan State and Duffy Daugherty with the first fully integrated roster showed the way, particularly with the 1966 game of the century, with 33 million people, where Michigan State had 20 black players, 11 black starters, 2 black team captains, George Webster and Clinton Jones, both in the College Football Hall of Fame, and then Jimmy Ray, the South's first black quarterback to win a national title.
Wow.
USC, the only reason they talk about them being fully integrated by 1970, the only reason they had 18 black players in 1970 is 13 of them were transfers from the 1969 and 1970 seasons. And 12 of those 13 were junior college transfers.
Right.
So in other words, prior to 1970, they were sticking to that half dozen unwritten quota. But the point I wanted to get back to is, and again, as I said before, this is not criticism for Sam Cunningham. And I believe Sam Cunningham later realized that he had been used as a pawn, because the USC story is framed as if this integrated team from California came down and shocked the Alabama fans and George Wallace. And after that, Bear Bryant was allowed to recruit black players. None of that is true. First of all, George Wallace wasn't even in office. Second of all, Bear Bryant had already recruited a black player, Wilbur Jackson.
Right.
He was a freshman back then. Freshmen weren't eligible for the varsity before USC ever got there. But most importantly of all, in 1969, Tennessee. Remember, I said Tennessee was integrated in as early as 1967 with Lester McLean. 1969, Tennessee went down to Legion Field in Birmingham, and Jackie Wallace, two-time All-American in 1970 and 1971, 69, it was his sophomore year. He intercepted a pass early in the game, returned it for a touchdown, and Tennessee routed Alabama in front of their Legion Stadium field, all white. And it was 41-14 was the score. That if USC, if there was a pivotal point for Alabama fans to be shocked and enlightened to join the 20th century, that was it. Not a year later with USC. And, you know, I made a joke about how someone at Stanford should have made up a story to celebrate you. For Jackie Wallace, it truly is an injustice because Jackie Wallace is not in the College Football Hall of Fame, two-time All-American, first Black All-American player in the Southeastern Conference. Wow. And Sam Cunningham is. That's what I mean. I want to read another quote here for our viewers. It's from Lane Demas, who's a historian and professor at Central Michigan University. He wrote a book called The Integration of the Gridiron. And he talks about how all these myths were made up about the USC-Alabama game to cover up Alabama's poor record. And here's what he says: I still believe the Cunningham story is not about celebrating Cunningham or USC, nor is it even really about celebrating Bryant or Alabama, Lane Demas says. It's one of the many white stories that emerged in the South during the 1970s that were meant to denigrate King, the countless marches and protests, the student sit-ins, and even the Civil Rights Acts, Voting Rights Act, U.S. Supreme Court. And the ultimate point of the Cunningham-Bryant myth is, see, we didn't need any of that other stuff. We were going to integrate anyways.
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that because there was a joke, or it was told as a joke. And I even kind of laughed at it too. I wasn't thinking, you know, more deeply about the inferences that it was making. But they said that there was a saying that somebody said that SC and Sam Cunningham did more to promote civil rights than Martin Luther King did in Alabama.
Yeah,
you know, I chuckled at it.
Yeah,
but I really didn't digest it. You know, the intent, where it came from, and all that. I just thought that was okay.
And that's why the myth and the fiction has been successful, but none of the facts add up because he had already recruited his first black player. And as I stated before, Auburn had recruited a black player. The part of the whole myth was that Bear Bryant scheduled USC as a game to lose so that George Wallace would let him recruit black athletes. Well, he had already recruited Wilbur Jackson.
Oh wow! I didn't know the story went that deep.
Yeah, he had already recruited Wilbur Jackson a year before. Shub Jordan at Auburn had recruited James Owens as their first black player. So Jordan didn't get fired. He kept coaching. The reality is Bryant, and as I said before, Alabama was the 7th of 10 SEC schools. And so there's absolutely no evidence to support this myth, but it caught on in large part because of this funny line attributed to Jerry Claiborne. And it's more urban legend than it is fact, because sometimes you see him quoted as the Kentucky coach sometimes quoted as the Maryland coach. He was actually the coaching at Virginia Tech at the time. And that's part of what I've said is the myth and the fiction was made up 20 years later. And the
Wow.
people that, and the consequence is the guys who did the sacrifice, I don't have to tell you, Hillary, we don't solve racial problems overnight. It takes a lot of marching and sacrificing by a lot of people. And that was the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King going back to the 50s, 1955, and the Montgomery bus boycott. And then all the doors that slowly opened for Black players in the South that were pushed open by the examples that was going on at Michigan State with Duffy Daugherty, with his Black athletes, not only from the Midwest, but from the segregated South. And it's just a shame that Bear Bryant, a man who dragged his feet on integration, is getting credit for being a crusader, because he was anything but that. And I'll tell you a little story. Bob Grant, who was at Wake Forest in 1964, he had planned to ride the Underground Railroad to Michigan State with Jimmy Ray. They were both from North Carolina high schools.
Wow.
They played against each other. That's how respected Michigan State and Duffy Daugherty were. And then the Wake Forest coach decided that they were going to integrate. They took the brave step, Bill Tate. And Bob Grant's high school coach told him that they're trying to change history and they want you to be one of the leaders. And so Bob Grant, on that condition, gave up on his plans to go to Michigan State. And Bob ended up going to, he was a star at Wake Forest, second round draft pick by the Baltimore Colts. He was the first Black player from a major Southern college drafted in the NFL. Do you know that fact?
No,
you don't, because the Sam Cunningham Bear Bryant story has pushed everything into the shadows. And Bob Grant tells me, and this is in my book, The Right Thing to Do, that will be available January 1st, the true 1960s pioneers of college football integration. Bob Grant says that he and Reggie Berry, who played at Long Beach State and also in the NFL with the Chargers, were talking with Sam Cunningham one night, and they told Sam, USC did not integrate college football. And Sam said, "Oh, yes, we did. Yes, we did." So then Reggie Berry proceeded to tell him about all the Black stars throughout the 60s, including Bob Grant sitting in the room with them.
Mhm.
And Sam Cunningham went silent. And he said, "I didn't know that."
That's right.
And then, and then there's an interview in the Los Angeles Times in 2016 where Sam Cunningham says that the story. Let's add this too, because part of it, what made that myth work so much, is they said Bear Bryant brought Sam Cunningham into the locker room to show his players what a football player looked like. None of that's true. Sam Cunningham ended up denying it, saying it never happened. And then he said in this 2016 LA Times interview, their game was a big enough game that it didn't need all this sauce added to it. That's why I said earlier, I think Sam realized he had been used as a pawn by the people who made up that myth. It's a pleasure to have you on here. It's so hard to break an entrenched myth. And a lot of people would say, well, you're from Michigan State. That's the only reason you write all this stuff. But I defy anybody to dispute the facts that I put on. I will put my research up against anybody, anytime, anywhere. And I was researching a little bit more. I'll wrap it up this way. I was researching a little bit more about that 1970 game. And that's when I came across, in the same edition of the LA Times, of the USC Alabama game, the Stanford Arkansas game. And right at the top of the page, it talks about the Stanford fullback running wild, Hillary Shockley. And I said to myself, if this Hillary Shockley guy is Black, it'll be the most ironic thing ever. Did a little Google search, and there you were, Hillary the Shocker Shockley. So I want to congratulate your team. for its great place in history and condemn college football lore for not giving credit to the right people. Stanford in 1970, Tennessee of 1969, and Michigan State throughout the 1960s, and then all those individual players that I mentioned earlier, like Jerry Levias. Your final thoughts, Hillary.
Well, my final thoughts looking back 50 years, I'm reminded of something that I don't know who told me this, but I just remember that, if you know better, you can do better. But if you don't know any better, chances are you don't do it.
Yeah. Well, let me add to that. Martin Luther King always said one of the problems with the civil rights movement and segregation in the South is the good people, the good white people in the South who remain silent. And that Bear Bryant was one of those people. In 1963, the KKK bombed the 16th Street Church, Baptist Church. And Bear Bryant never spoke up. Bear Bryant never took any kind of leadership role, even though Hal Raines, the old New York Times editor, who grew up in Alabama, was a fierce Alabama fan, says, if anybody could have spoken out, it would have been Bear Bryant, and he didn't do it. I thought of one more thing while you were talking. You mentioned your friend Bill Holland scored a touchdown. Bill was an African-American also. Actually, Sam Cunningham wasn't even the starting fullback. A guy named Charlie Evans was the returning starting fullback, a white guy who went on and played 5 years in the NFL, was a good player. He scored a touchdown against Alabama as well as Bill Holland, your friend, an African-American. So 3 fullbacks scored touchdowns that night. And part of the myth is that Bear Bryant planned this game to have Sam Cunningham run over his team. Well, Sam Cunningham wasn't even a starter. He hadn't even played a varsity game. He was on the freshman team in 1969.
Right.
And Charlie Evans was not only the starter, he was the returning starter, good enough to go in and play the NFL. And as I mentioned before, USC had followed a quota. They only had 4 black starters at Alabama. They had Jimmy Jones at quarterback. They had Clarence Davis, a junior college transfer at tailback, Charlie Weaver, a linebacker, junior college transfer, and Tody Smith, who started his career at Michigan State and was a transfer. So they only had 1 4-year black recruit start that game. They were anything but a model of an integrated program. That didn't happen until the 70s when USC was following in line with everybody else, catching up with history. But I wanted to add that because what you said about Bill Holland is important to mention. So one more time, Hillary, give us your final comment.
Well, my final comment is that, sports is a level playing field, but it's not without its drawbacks and its weaknesses, because we come from a society that has peculiar origins, and sometimes it's not all inclusive. Too often it's not. And even with all of the issues, sports is probably one of the best examples of how we can learn to live together and play together.
Yes.
But
and
not
right. And we don't need, go ahead.
But not without its problems.
Yeah.
And its hypocrisy and prejudice.
Yeah.
That's something that's a matter of the heart.
Right. And we don't need to make up stories about games to get that point across, because it happened in real life, what you guys did at Arkansas that night. So thank you again for joining us,
pleasure.
Hillary Shockley, the real Sam Cunningham, for joining us on the End Game.
Thank you.
All right.